On the 18th of January 1945, the most feared armoured fist in the Waffen-SS rolled out from south of Lake Balaton with one job: punch through the Soviet ring, reach Budapest, save tens of thousands of trapped Germans and Hungarians dying inside the encircled city. The fist was the 4th SS Panzer Corps under Herbert Otto Gieler, two veteran Waffen-SS Panzer divisions. 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf on the right, 5th SS Panzer Division Viking on the left. Panthers and Tigers that had killed Soviet armour from Kharkov to Warsaw. Crews who had survived 2.5 years of the worst meat grinder in human history. Men the Red Army feared by name. 9 days later, 25 kilometers short of the city, the whole attack was a smoking line of dead tanks on a Hungarian road. It was not killed by infantry. It was not killed by air. It was killed by a gun the SS Panzer Arm had openly mocked for a year. A gun so slow its crews could only fire 2 or 3 shells a minute. A gun lifted off a 1931 Corps artillery piece and shoved into a tank turret by a man working out of a converted artillery shop in Sverdlovsk. The Soviet D-25T, 122mm, mounted on the IS-2 heavy tank. This is the story of how the slowest tank gun on the Eastern Front ended the careers of more Totenkopf panzer crews than any other Soviet weapon in the war. Budapest, Hungary, December 26, 1944. On that day, Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front and Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front shook hands west of the city. The road to Vienna was cut. The capital of Hungary was sealed. Inside the pocket sat the 1st Hungarian Army, the 9th SS Mountain Corps, German garrison troops, Hungarian gendarmes, and 800,000 civilians. Hitler refused to let any of them break out. Budapest was to be held to the last man, the last shell, the last frozen loaf of bread. To save them, the German High Command turned to the only formation in southern Europe still strong enough to drive through a Soviet front: the 4th SS Panzer Corps. Gieler's corps was the German Army's emergency fire brigade. Totenkopf and Viking had stood up the Eastern Front at Kharkov. They had bled the Soviets white at Warsaw. Now they were yanked off the Vistula, loaded into rail cars in the middle of winter, and shipped 600 kilometers south to Lake Balaton with one mission: rip a hole through Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front and reach the trapped garrison before it starved. The corps came under the command of General Hermann Balck's 6th Army, supported on the left by the 3rd Panzer Corps. 3 separate relief attempts were planned, 3 swings of the same hammer. The first swing was Operation Konrad I. It started on the 1st of January 1945, launched out of the Tatar region. By the 6th of January, it was dead at the foot of the Gorecha Hills. Halted near Bichka and Zhambek by Soviet anti-tank fire, it could not crack. The second swing was Konrad II. It started on the 7th of January, launched from Esztergom along the Pilis ridgeline. By the 12th of January, the SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment Westland had reached Pilisentkerest, 20 kilometers from Buda. 20 kilometers. The men inside Budapest could hear the guns. And then Konrad II stalled too. The terrain was impossible. The Soviet defense was deeper than expected, and Gieler had to pull back before the spearhead was cut off. So the planners loaded everything that was left into a 3rd attempt: Konrad III, the largest of the 3. The one that had to work because there would not be a 4th. Now, you have to understand what the Soviets had waiting for them on that 3rd attempt. By mid-January 1945, Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front was thinly stretched along the Margit line west of Budapest. The 4th Guards Army held the most exposed sector, with infantry, towed anti-tank guns, and a handful of armoured reserves. Behind them sat the heavy tank regiments, independent regiments built around a single weapon: the IS-2. The IS-2 was a 46-ton monster. Cast steel turret, smooth and rounded like a river boulder. Steeply sloped frontal armour, 90 to 120 millimeters thick. And in that turret, a gun that broke every rule the German Panzer arm believed in. The D-25T was designed by Fyodor Fyodorovich Petrov, head of the Artillery Experimental Design Bureau at Factory No. 9 in Sverdlovsk. Petrov had taken over the bureau in 1940, when it was still part of the giant Uralmash works. In 1942, the artillery operation was carved out as a separate plant, given the bare designation Factory 9, and Petrov was named chief designer. He was a quiet man, an artillery engineer who had grown up working on towed core guns, and he believed the German Tiger problem had a simple answer. Hit it harder than it could hit you, even if you only hit it once a minute. His answer was not a clean sheet design. It was a tank adaptation of the A-19, a Soviet Corps artillery piece from 1931. The A-19 had been a long-range, deep echelon weapon, dragged into firing position by tractors and dug in for siege work. The Germans had captured A-19s by the hundreds in the early years of the war and stockpiled them as towed guns, mostly using them to lob shells across rivers in the east. Nobody on the German side believed that a piece that old, that heavy, that slow, could be useful inside a moving tank. That belief is what killed Totenkopf. Petrov shortened the A-19 tube, modified the breech for tank use, kept the original ballistics, and handed the design to the IS heavy tank program. The man who took it from there was Josif Yakovlevich Kotin, the head of SKB-2, the heavy tank design bureau at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant. Kotin had been the chief designer of the pre-war KV-1 and KV-2 heavy tanks. After the German invasion, he had been evacuated east with the Leningrad-Kirov works in 1941, and his bureau had become the brain of the giant Ural tank factory the Soviets called Tankograd, the largest armoured vehicle production complex on the planet. In the middle of 1943, Kotin's team built the prototype that became the IS-2. They called it Object 240. They tested two competing main guns, Petrov's D-25T and a sleeker, faster-firing 100mm, the D-10. The choice came down to a single test. Both guns were fired at a captured Panther parked on a Ural range. The 100mm cracked the turret face, the 122 ripped it off. The decision was made. Yes, the rate of fire was lower, 2 to 3 rounds a minute against 5 or 6. Yes, the ammunition was separate loading, projectile and propellant in 2 pieces, hand-fed by one exhausted loader in a cramped turret. But one good shell from the D-25T did more damage than 3 from a 100mm, and against the German cats, more damage per shot was the only thing that mattered. In January 1944, 2 weeks after the IS-2 entered series production, Fyodor Petrov was named a hero of socialist labour. By the end of the war, his Factory No. 9 had pushed gun after gun into Soviet service, and his tank version of the A-19 had become the most feared heavy gun on the Eastern Front. Production of the IS-2 ran from late 1943 through the end of the war. Chelyabinsk-Kirov pushed out 35 tanks in January 1944, 75 in February, 150 in April, and over 225 a month from July onward. By V-Day, the plant had built more than 3,800 IS-2s. The workforce at Chelyabinsk-Kirov swelled to 60,000 people. Half or more were women, working 3 shifts, sleeping on factory floors, hand-fitting tank turrets in a cold so deep the breech grease froze on the assembly line. That was the machine waiting for Totenkopf at Balaton. The D-25T fired the BR-471B, armour-piercing, ballistic-capped, high-explosive filler. The kind of shell that does not just punch a hole through armour, it punches a hole, then detonates inside the crew compartment. The numbers from the German WWII test office tell the story. WWII tested everything they captured. They tested the IS-2 too, and their own report concluded that the D-25T would penetrate the front of a Tiger I between 500 and 1,500 meters. At Kubinka, Soviet engineers ran the same test on a captured Tiger they had hauled back from the front. They confirmed it. Frontal turret kill at 1,000 to 1,500 meters. Weld seam kill on the lower hull at 500 to 600 meters. From the side, a Panther was vulnerable to the BR-471B at well over 2 kilometers. That meant a Soviet IS-2 sitting in a hull-down ambush in the snow could kill a Tiger or a Panther from a range where the German gunner could not even see the muzzle flash through the storm. And in January 1945, the snow never stopped. January 18th, 1945, 0 hour. The 4th SS Panzer Corps jumped off from south of Lake Balaton, Totenkopf on the right, Viking on the left. The 3rd Panzer Corps in support to the north. Panthers and Tigers running on frozen mud, low clouds overhead, the temperature near 0, visibility cut to a few hundred meters by snowstorms blowing in off the Hungarian plain. For the first 48 hours, it looked like a German classic. Giel's spearheads tore through the Soviet 4th Guards Army. They overran towed anti-tank positions. They crushed infantry trenches under track and shell. Soviet tank crews fell back in confusion. By the end of the first day, a German breach 30 kilometers wide and 60 kilometers deep had been torn through Tolbukin's line. By the morning of January 19th, lead elements of the 4th SS Panzer Corps reached the Danube, splitting the Soviet forces in Transdanubia in half. Hundreds of Soviet tanks burned along the road. 400 square kilometers of ground had been recaptured in 4 days. Inside Budapest, the trapped garrison heard the gunfire to the southwest and counted the hours. But this was the part everyone missed at the time. Tolbukin had not committed his real anti-armor reserve. The IS-2 heavy regiments were still pulling back, repositioning, finding the ground they wanted. Soviet defensive doctrine on the Third Ukrainian Front had been hammered into shape over 2 years of Eastern Front fighting. The infantry and the towed anti-tank guns up front were not the main line of resistance. They were the bait. They were there to slow the German spearhead, force it to deploy, and channel the lead tanks down a specific axis. The real killers, the IS-2 regiments, were always held one terrain feature back, parked in farmhouses, behind hedgerows, in the lee of a low rise, with overlapping fields of fire and pre-measured ranges to every road bend in front of them. They were not going to fight Totenkopf at speed on open ground. They were going to fight Totenkopf on terrain they chose, at the moment they chose, with the first shot they chose. By the afternoon of January 19th, the Soviet High Command had identified the German axis. Stavka released reserves to Tolbukin overnight. The 30th Rifle Corps, the 54th Rifle Corps, and the 23rd Tank Corps were ordered forward. The 5th Guards Cavalry Corps, with 100 tanks, 360 artillery pieces, 3 anti-tank gun regiments, and 6 artillery regiments, was thrown into the gap. They marched 60 kilometers in 24 hours, in winter, on icy roads, and arrived on January 20th. And in front of them, dug in along the side roads and tree lines between Székesfehérvár and the Budapest pocket, the IS-2 regiments were already waiting. That was the moment Operation Konrad III stopped being a German offensive and became a German graveyard. Picture the ground in your head. Snowfields broken by orchards and frozen ditches. Single-track village roads with high embankments on either side. Stands of bare timber. Low farmhouses with brick walls. Visibility on a good morning, 600 to 800 meters. On a bad morning, less than 200. The Panther and the Tiger were built to fight at long range across open steppe. The IS-2 and the D-25T were built to fight at the range where you could see the man you were killing. And in that ground, the slow gun became the fast gun. A Totenkopf Panther rolled around a bend at 400 meters. The IS-2, hull down behind a low rise in the snow, had been zeroed on that exact bend for an hour. The Soviet commander had picked the spot the day before. The gunner had laid the breech, checked the elevation, and waited. The loader had a ready rack of 6 BR-471B shells stacked by his knee. One shell from the D-25T, the Panthers' turret face cracked, the round went through. The high-explosive filler detonated inside the fighting compartment. The tank shuddered, slewed sideways, and caught fire. The commander in the cupola was dead before his body hit the deck plate. The next Panther in line braked and tried to back up. The road behind it was packed with vehicles, half-tracks, fuel trucks, a recovery vehicle. There was no room. The second IS-2 shell hit it in the lower glacis, right at the weld seam. Same result. The hull split. The ammunition cooked off. The turret lifted off its ring in a column of black smoke 100 feet high. Now the road was blocked. The third Panther tried to push out into the ditch to bypass the burning wrecks. The frozen ground was too hard. The ice broke under the tracks. The tank threw a track and stopped. The crew bailed out and ran for the tree line. They never made it. A Soviet infantry section had been waiting in the ditch the entire time. 2 minutes. 3 tanks destroyed. The IS-2 had fired 6 shells. The Panthers had not fired 1. They had never even acquired the target. That was the pattern, repeated across the relief axis across 14 days. At Petend, at Aber, at Seragelies, at the rail crossings outside Székesfehérvár, at every single road junction where a Totenkopf column tried to push north toward Budapest, an IS-2 regiment was already waiting in the trees with the gun loaded. Read that again. The most feared panzer crews in the Waffen-SS, in the best heavy tanks the Reich could build, lost the duel because the slow gun got the first shot from 1,000 meters away, and 1 shot was all it took. By January 22nd, Totenkopf's armoured corps was being bled away tank by tank. The corps was still pushing forward, but for every kilometre gained, another panzer was lost. And in this fight, the loss rates worked the wrong way. Germany could not replace a Panther in 24 hours. The Red Army could replace an IS-2 in a day, because the conveyor at Chelyabinsk-Kirov never stopped. A Totenkopf after-action report from late January, preserved in captured German records, put the problem in plain language. Russian heavy tanks were engaging from 1,800 meters with 122 mm guns. The Panthers could not reply effectively at that range. The losses in lead elements were now severe. Severe is a clean word for what was actually happening. SS Panzer commanders, men who had survived Kursk and Kharkov and the long retreat across Ukraine, were dying in their turrets because a Soviet artillery piece from 1931 had been shoved into a tank and was now killing them at a range where they could not even fight back. I mean, think about that for a second. The Corps tried to find a way around. Gill shifted weight. He pushed Viking forward on a new axis. The result was the same. Wherever the German Panthers and Tigers tried to advance, the IS-2s were already in position, hull down, waiting, with the D-25T pre-aimed on the most likely choke point. The Soviet defense was no longer a line. It was a series of nested kill boxes, each one designed around a single IS-2 regiment, with infantry and anti-tank guns filling the gaps between. January 25th, 25 kilometers from Budapest. The 4th SS Panzer Corps was running out of running tanks. The infantry was exhausted. The fuel state was bad. The temperature dropped again overnight. January 26th. Soviet reinforcements were piled in along the last 15 kilometers. The road forward was a kill zone of dug-in IS-2s, anti-tank guns, and mechanized infantry. Gill requested permission to halt and consolidate. Permission was denied. He halted anyway. There was nothing left to push with. January 27th. Tolbukin opened his counteroffensive with 3 mechanized corps and 1 rifle corps, aimed at encircling the lead German elements. Operation Konrad III was officially over. The corps had not reached Budapest. It had not even seen Budapest. It had been stopped by an obsolete artillery piece in a tank turret, fired by crews who knew exactly how to make 2 rounds a minute hit harder than 8. By the end of January, Viking and Totenkopf together had suffered 8,000 casualties, including 200 officers. The German Sixth Army had lost 164 armoured vehicles across the 3 Konrad operations, with more than 70 wrecks abandoned on the field because there was no fuel or recovery vehicles to drag them home. Inside the city, the garrison waited 2 more weeks. On the night of February 11th, the surviving defenders launched a breakout attempt toward the German lines. Roughly 30,000 men tried to fight their way out through the suburbs of Buda. Of those 30,000, only 785 reached friendly territory. The rest were killed, wounded, captured, or scattered in the hills west of the city. On February 13, 1945, Budapest fell. The 1st Hungarian Army was destroyed. The 9th SS Mounting Corps was destroyed. According to the historian Christian Ungvari, the most thorough chronicler of the siege, 38,000 civilians died inside the city, 13,000 from military action, 25,000 from starvation, disease, exposure, and the mass executions carried out by the Hungarian Arrow Cross. The Soviet forces had paid for the city with somewhere between 100,000 and 160,000 of their own casualties. And the 4th SS Panzer Corps, the German Army's last fire brigade, never recovered. Totenkopf would fight on, but as a depleted shadow of the formation that had rolled out from Balaton in January. By April, the division was retreating into Austria. By May, it was gone. Now, here is the part that almost no one talks about. The D-25T did not just outlast Totenkopf, it outlasted the entire Cold War. The gun stayed in Soviet service for decades. It was mounted on IS-2 heavy tanks shipped to Korea in the early 1950s, used by Chinese crews against American forces along the Yalu River. It was rolled into Budapest a second time in November 1956, this time by Soviet crews, crushing the Hungarian uprising, with the same 122mm gun, firing into the same streets where Totenkopf had tried to break through 11 years earlier. Hungarian rebels with Molotov cocktails fought IS-2s in the same intersections where their fathers had watched Soviet tanks roll past in 1945. The IS-2M, an upgraded post-war rebuild with better optics and a stabilized gun, was still in active Soviet reserve in the early 1990s, almost 50 years after Konrad III. Variants and derivatives of the D-25T served in the Middle East into the 1970s, with Syrian and Egyptian crews firing the same separate loading drill Petrov had designed in a freezing Sverdlovsk workshop in 1943. Cuban crews trained on the IS-2. Chinese tank schools still drilled on the loading rhythm into the 1980s. A 1931 artillery piece pushed into a tank in 1943, still serving 60 years later. You can walk into a museum today in Moscow, in Warsaw, in Prague, in Kubinka, and stand in front of an IS-2 with the D-25T still in the turret. The same gun that broke Totenkopf in 14 days outside Budapest is still there, cleaned, restored, displayed under spotlights. A 16-foot barrel of cold grey steel that ended the careers of more SS Panzer crews than any other Soviet tank gun in the war. The SS Panzer Arm called it slow. They were not wrong. 2 rounds a minute is slow. They were wrong about everything else. A slow gun that hits the way the D-25T hit does not need to fire 8 rounds a minute. It needs to fire 1 round, well, at the right range, from the right position, against the right target. And in the snow and broken ground outside Budapest in January 1945, the IS-2 regiments of the 3rd Ukrainian Front did exactly that, again and again, for 14 days. until the most feared panzer corps in the Waffen-SS was a smoking line of dead tanks on a Hungarian road, 25 kilometers from a city it never reached. If you want to see how another Soviet weapon the Germans dismissed as obsolete tore apart an entire SS Panzer Division, click the next video on screen. And if you made it this far, subscribe. The Eastern Front has more of these stories than most people realize.